Athens. In 430 BCE, inside the fortified walls of Athens, a city that believed itself protected by stone, ships, and strategy, began to die from something no soldier could see. The Peloponnesian War had already turned Greece into a battlefield. Sparta controlled the land. Athens controlled the sea. To protect the population from invasion, Pericles ordered people from the countryside to move behind the long walls, the massive defensive corridor connecting Athens to the port of Piraeus. It was a brilliant military decision on paper. It turned Athens into a sealed human reservoir. Families, refugees, animals, soldiers, merchants, and supplies crowded into the city until every street, shrine, and open space became dense with breath, waste, fear, and waiting. Then ships arrived at Piraeus. Soon after, the sickness followed. The first reports were strange because the disease did not behave like an ordinary seasonal illness. It seemed to appear suddenly, striking the head first with violent heat, red inflamed eyes, bleeding in the throat, and breath so foul that witnesses remembered the smell. Victims developed sneezing, coughing, stomach spasms, vomiting, and an internal burning that made them desperate for water. Some threw themselves into wells. Others tore off clothing because even light fabric felt unbearable against the skin. Their bodies broke out in sores and discolorations. Many died around the 7th or 9th day. Those who survived often lost fingers, toes, sight, memory, or strength. The disease did not spare age, class, wealth, or rank. Physicians were among the first to die because they were closest to the infected. What made the outbreak terrifying was not only the number of deaths, but the collapse of meaning inside Athens. The city had survived war, siege, and political tension, but this was different. The gods did not seem to answer. Temples filled with the sick and dying. Sacred places became crowded shelters of fever and rot. Funeral customs, once central to Athenian identity, began to fail. Families no longer had the strength to bury their dead properly. Some bodies were thrown onto funeral pyres already built for others. Some were abandoned where they fell. The normal boundary between the living and the dead dissolved in public view. Thucydides, the historian who survived the disease himself, recorded the outbreak with a cold precision that still feels like an autopsy of civilization. He did not describe a city merely suffering. He described a city losing its moral structure. People stopped fearing laws because death seemed imminent. Some spent recklessly. Others acted without restraint. The future had become too uncertain to obey. When a city no longer believes tomorrow is guaranteed, every rule becomes fragile. The authorities had no answer. There was no germ theory, no quarantine science, no understanding of vectors, contaminated water, crowding, or microbial spread. Rumors filled the gap. Some claimed the Spartans had poisoned the wells. Others saw divine punishment. Priests searched for meaning in old prophecies. Politicians tried to preserve order while the death carts multiplied. Yet the most important evidence vanished not through conspiracy, but through time. No preserved pathogen, no complete medical archive, no final diagnosis. Modern theories have suggested typhus, typhoid fever, smallpox, measles, Ebola-like hemorrhagic fever, or something now lost to history. None fully explains every detail. The plague returned in waves and helped break the confidence of Athens at the worst possible moment. Pericles himself died during the crisis. The city survived, but not unchanged. Its democracy, military discipline, religious certainty, and civic identity had all been wounded from within. Sparta never breached the long walls during that first disaster. It did not need to. Something smaller than dust had already entered. Athens had built walls against men, but no wall could stop the thing carried in breath. Hattusa. In the 14th century BCE, on the high plateau of central Anatolia, the Hittite capital of Hattusa stood behind massive stone walls, lion gates, royal archives, temples, and fortress towers built to intimidate every enemy that approached from the outside. The city was not a fragile settlement. It was the nerve center of a Bronze Age superpower, a place where kings sent armies across Anatolia, Syria, and northern Mesopotamia. Hattusa could absorb siege, rebellion, and political shock. But during the reign of King Mursili II, something entered the empire that no army could push back: It did not attack the gates, it moved through people. The outbreak appears in one of the most haunting records of the ancient world, the plague prayers of Mursili II. These were not ordinary religious texts. They read like emergency testimony from a ruler watching his kingdom decay under a punishment he could not understand. According to the Hittite records, the disease had already been raging for years before Mursili took the throne. His father, Suppiluliuma I, had died. His brother, Arnuwanda II, had died. The royal family itself had been struck. The sickness did not remain among the poor, the prisoners, or the servants. The plague reached the palace. The suspected origin was connected to war. Hittite campaigns in Syria had brought back prisoners, tribute, and captives from infected regions. What looked like victory may have carried contamination into the heart of the empire. The returning columns did not bring only gold, weapons, animals, and slaves. They may have carried fever, infected breath, tainted clothing, and death hidden inside human bodies. By the time the sickness reached Hattusa, no one could easily separate triumph from disaster. The road that fed the empire had become the road of infection. Inside Hattusa, the symptoms are not described with the clinical precision of later Greek writers. The Hittite tablets speak instead through fear, ritual, and guilt. People died for years. The disease persisted long enough to become more than a medical crisis. It became a political and spiritual siege. Mursili searched the archives for forgotten sins. He asked whether broken treaties had angered the gods. He wondered whether his father's actions had brought divine punishment upon the land. This is what makes Hattusa different from Athens. Athens saw social order collapse under visible suffering. Hattusa transformed disease into a legal case before heaven. The city's temples must have become centers of desperate negotiation. Priests performed rituals. Offerings were made. Old tablets were examined for crimes against divine law. The king did not merely ask for healing. He pleaded for the gods to identify the reason. That detail is chilling. It shows that the Hittites were not only afraid of death, they were afraid the plague had meaning. If disease was punishment, then every corpse was evidence in a trial no human court could understand. The administration of the empire continued, but under pressure. A plague that lasts through multiple reigns does not simply kill bodies. It weakens manpower, military readiness, agriculture, tribute systems, and the faith that kings rule with divine approval. Hattusa remains standing, its stone walls intact, its archives still active, its temples still filled with smoke and offerings. Yet the invisible damage spread through the structures that made the city powerful. Soldiers vanished from ranks, workers vanished from fields, families vanished from houses. The empire survived the outbreak, but something in its confidence was permanently scarred. No one today can identify the exact disease. The tablets preserve prayers, not pathogens. No sealed medical sample remains. No diagnosis can be extracted from the clay. But the unanswered question may be more disturbing than the disease itself. What if one of the greatest powers of the Bronze Age was weakened not by an enemy kingdom, but by a sickness carried home as the shadow of conquest? Hattusa had walls built for invaders, but the plague entered as a consequence of victory. Thebes. In the 3rd century CE, on the western bank of the Nile near ancient Thebes, death began to leave marks that ordinary burial could not explain. Thebes had once been one of Egypt's most sacred cities, a place of temples, royal tombs, processions, priesthoods, and stone monuments built for eternity. Even after its political power faded, the landscape remained charged with ritual meaning. The dead were not treated casually here. Bodies were prepared, wrapped, buried, remembered, and placed within a cosmic order that Egyptians had preserved for thousands of years. But during one violent outbreak in the Roman period, that order appears to have broken. Archaeologists working in the Theban necropolis found evidence of a mass disposal site, unlike the careful tombs surrounding it. Human remains had been treated in ways that suggested urgency, fear, and contamination. Bodies were burned. Lime was spread over the dead. The remains were not arranged with the dignity expected in a sacred burial landscape. They looked processed, reduced, neutralized. This was not the language of mourning. This was the language of emergency. The disease behind the site has often been linked to the great pandemic known as the Plague of Cyprian, which struck the Roman world during the 3rd century CE. Its exact cause remains uncertain. Ancient descriptions speak of fever, vomiting, weakness, throat wounds, intestinal distress, bleeding, and sudden collapse. Some modern theories suggest smallpox, measles, or a viral hemorrhagic disease. None can be confirmed. What matters in Thebes is not only what the disease was, but what the living were forced to do when the dead became too many. The use of lime is especially disturbing. Lime was not a ceremonial material in the normal Egyptian funerary sense. It was practical. It could accelerate decomposition, reduce odor, and help contain bodies believed to be dangerous. Burning the remains also points to a breakdown in standard funerary procedure. In a culture where preservation of the body was tied to belief in the afterlife, the destruction of bodies was not a minor detail. It suggests that fear of contagion had become stronger than tradition. The living were no longer asking how to honor the dead. They were asking how to survive them. Imagine the city under that pressure. The temples still stood. The Nile still moved. Markets may still have opened in the morning. But somewhere near the necropolis, workers carried bodies not toward eternal rest, but toward mass disposal. There may have been no time for individual names, no time for proper offerings, no time for family grief. A sacred city had been forced into a grim calculation. How many bodies can be moved before sunset? How much lime remains? How many more will arrive tomorrow? The silence around the outbreak is part of its power. Thebes did not leave behind a single clean explanation. No complete medical account survives from the city itself. No preserved pathogen identifies the killer. No official tablet describes the moment when burial customs failed. Instead, the evidence lies in scorched bone, chemical residue, and the unnatural speed of disposal. A civilization that built tombs to defeat oblivion suddenly faced a form of death too fast for memory to contain. Authorities in the Roman world had little control over such outbreaks. Cities could close gates, restrict movement, pray, burn incense, and remove bodies, but none of these measures could reveal the invisible mechanism of infection. The disease moved faster than doctrine. It turned priests, workers, families, and officials into witnesses of a truth too brutal for their rituals. When death came in numbers large enough, even sacred geography could become a dumping ground. Thebes was not erased in a single day. Its stones did not fall because of this outbreak. But something more intimate was damaged. The city's oldest promise was that the dead could be carried safely into eternity. During the plague, that promise appears to have failed. In Thebes, the mystery is not only why so many died, it is why a city built around the dignity of death had to burn its dead like a threat. Alexandria. In the 3rd century CE, on the crowded waterfront of Alexandria, a city built to gather the world began to receive something no customs officer could inspect. Ships entered the great harbor from every direction, grain vessels from the Nile Delta, merchant ships from the Levant, military transports from Rome, cargo boats from North Africa. Alexandria was not merely a city beside the sea. It was a machine of movement. Every dock, warehouse, market, library hall, temple court, and narrow residential street depended on the constant arrival of people and goods. Then the sickness came through the same channels that had made the city powerful. The first deaths likely seemed ordinary. A sailor collapsing after days at sea. A dock worker seized by fever. A merchant too weak to stand inside a counting house. In a port as busy as Alexandria, illness was expected. But this outbreak did not remain contained among strangers at the edge of the city. It moved inward, from the harbor to the grain stores, from the grain stores to the markets, from the markets into packed housing districts where families lived close enough to hear each other breathe through thin walls. The city's greatest advantage, its connection to the world, became its most dangerous weakness. Ancient descriptions from the wider Roman world during this period speak of a disease that struck with fever, severe weakness, throat pain, vomiting, intestinal distress, and in some accounts, bleeding and bodily corruption. The exact pathogen remains uncertain. Some modern theories suggest smallpox, others suggest measles or a hemorrhagic fever. But to the people inside Alexandria, the name mattered less than the speed. A person could appear alive in the morning and be unreachable by night. The sick crowded homes, courtyards, and religious spaces. The living struggled to separate care from exposure. Every act of mercy became a possible doorway for death. Alexandria's geography made the crisis worse. The city was dense, humid, and dependent on stored food, imported goods, and water management systems that required constant maintenance. Warehouses attracted rodents, ships carried insects, waste, contaminated cloth, and infected bodies. Public baths, fountains, temples, lecture halls, and markets kept people in circulation. A disease did not need to break through the city walls. Alexandria invited movement by design. Even silence could not stop transmission when the air, water, bedding, clothing, and touch had become suspect. The psychological collapse would have been brutal. Alexandria was a city of knowledge, mathematics, medicine, theology, and argument. It housed physicians, philosophers, priests, merchants, scribes, and administrators who believed the world could be classified, measured, debated, and explained. But plague mocked explanation. The same streets where scholars discussed the nature of the cosmos became corridors of fever. The same harbor that carried manuscripts and spices carried funerary dread. People who once argued over doctrine now watched neighbors vanish behind closed doors and wondered whether the gods, the stars, or the sea itself had turned against them. Authorities could respond only with fragments of control. Bodies had to be removed. Movement had to be managed. Temples and churches had to absorb the terrified. Officials had to protect the grain supply, while the workers handling that grain fell ill. Yet no decree could identify the invisible agent. No guard could search a ship for contagion hidden inside a flea, a cough, a garment, or a skin lesion. The archive of the outbreak is therefore incomplete. What survives is not a clean medical report, but a pattern. Port cities were struck with particular force because they were never truly closed. This is what makes Alexandria so haunting. The city was not defeated because it was isolated from the world. It suffered because it was too connected to the world. Its ships brought wealth, ideas, soldiers, and food. But the same ships may have brought the fever that turned prosperity into exposure. Alexandria's walls faced the land. Its real enemy came through the harbor, Carthage. In the middle of the 3rd century CE, inside the North African city of Carthage, death began entering homes faster than families could carry the bodies out. This was not the Carthage of Hannibal's wars, but the rebuilt Roman city that had risen from ruins into one of the great urban centers of the empire. Its streets were crowded with traders, laborers, officials, soldiers, priests, and families living under the hot Mediterranean sky. Carthage had survived conquest, destruction, and rebirth. But during the pandemic, later remembered through the writings of Bishop Cyprian, the city faced an enemy that did not arrive with banners, siege towers, or fire. It came through touch, breath, fear, and proximity. The outbreak struck during an age already breaking apart. The Roman Empire was under pressure from civil wars, frontier invasions, economic instability, and political assassinations. Then the disease appeared, spreading across provinces with terrifying speed. In Carthage, the sickness became more than a medical disaster. It became a test of the city's moral structure. Ancient descriptions speak of violent weakness, fever, vomiting, intestinal distress, throat wounds, and the loss of strength so complete that victims seemed to collapse inward while still alive. Some accounts describe blood, bodily decay, and sudden death after days of suffering. The exact pathogen remains unknown. Modern theories have proposed smallpox, measles, or a viral hemorrhagic fever. None can be proven. What makes Carthage especially haunting is the social reaction. In many cities, outbreaks created abandonment. The sick were avoided. Families fled from relatives. Servants left masters. Neighbors shut doors. The disease did not only attack the body, it attacked trust. Every household became a sealed chamber of suspicion. A cough behind a wall could become a warning. A fevered child could turn an entire family into prisoners of dread. The living faced an impossible choice: care for the infected and risk death, or preserve themselves and leave loved ones to die alone. Cyprian's writings reveal the outbreak through a religious lens, but beneath that language is something raw and human. He described the plague as a trial that exposed what people truly believed when survival was at stake. For Christians in Carthage, caring for the sick became an act of faith. For others, the same act looked like a death sentence. The city was divided not by walls, but by responses to the dying. Some approached the infected, others withdrew. In that division, Carthage became a laboratory of fear. The streets would have changed quickly. Markets thinned. Public gatherings became dangerous. Funerals multiplied until grief lost its sequence. The dead no longer arrived one by one. They came in waves from houses, workshops, alleys, and courtyards. Burial workers could not remain untouched forever. Priests and caregivers became exposed. Officials had to preserve order while the city's basic rhythms collapsed. Grain still had to be moved, water still had to be drawn, doors still had to open. But every necessary act created contact, and every contact carried uncertainty. Roman authorities had no real mechanism to stop the spread. They could command armies, collect taxes, punish rebels, and build roads across continents, but they could not see the agent moving from body to body. That blindness made the disease feel supernatural. If the cause could not be seen, then people searched for guilt. Was it divine anger, moral corruption, foreign contamination, a punishment for the empire? Each answer created more fear, because none stopped the deaths. Carthage was not erased from the map by the plague. But the outbreak revealed how fragile an ancient city became when private houses turned into sick rooms and public streets turned into corridors between the living and the dead. A city can survive fire and invasion if its people remain organized. But plague attacks organization itself. It makes the neighbor dangerous. It makes mercy costly. It makes the home unsafe. Carthage had once been destroyed by Rome from the outside. In the plague years, it faced a quieter destruction from within. Amida, in 359 CE, inside the fortified city of Amida in northern Mesopotamia, thousands of people were trapped behind walls while the world outside prepared to crush them. The Roman frontier was under assault by the Sasanian king Shapur II, whose army had moved across the region with siege engines, cavalry, archers, and elephants. Amida was not just another city. It was a strategic stronghold, a locked gate between empires. Soldiers, civilians, refugees, merchants, and local families crowded inside its defenses, hoping stone walls would protect them from the storm gathering beyond. But before the final collapse came from Persian weapons, another enemy began its work inside the city. The siege forced too many bodies into too little space. People who had fled the countryside packed themselves into courtyards, alleys, storage rooms, military quarters, and public buildings. Livestock stood near families. Waste accumulated. Water sources came under strain. Food grew scarce. The air thickened with smoke, sweat, rot, fear, and unwashed bodies. Every day projectiles struck the city. Every night, the defenders waited for ladders, tunnels, fire, or betrayal. Then sickness appeared among the crowded population, and Amida became more than a besieged city. It became a sealed container of infection. Ancient accounts describe disease spreading during the siege, likely intensified by overcrowding, exhaustion, contaminated conditions, and the presence of corpses that could not be removed properly. The symptoms are not preserved in the detail of a medical case file, but the pattern is clear. A city under siege loses the basic protections that keep disease from becoming catastrophe. Clean water becomes uncertain. Food becomes rationed. The wounded lie close to the healthy. The dead remain too near the living. Sleep disappears. Fear weakens the body before fever even arrives. This was the special horror of Amida. The people inside could not flee the disease because the enemy army was outside the walls. The people inside could not open the gates because capture meant slaughter, enslavement, or worse. The wall that protected them also imprisoned them with the outbreak. Every defensive success prolonged exposure. Every day the city resisted. The sickness gained more time to move from breath to breath, skin to skin, blanket to blanket. The military command had no clean solution. Soldiers were needed on the ramparts, but sick soldiers could barely stand. Civilians needed care, but caregivers became exposed. Bodies needed burial, but open movement during bombardment was dangerous. Public order had to be maintained, yet fear spread faster than orders. The city's defenders were fighting two sieges at once. One came from Shapur's army with towers, weapons, and pressure against the walls. The other came from inside the bloodstream, silent and without negotiation. Amida's streets must have become a map of collapse. At the gates, soldiers watched for Persian assault. In the houses behind them, families watched the breathing of the infected. Near the walls, the wounded cried from impact injuries. Deeper inside, Fevered residents lay in corners where no physician could safely remain for long. There was no separation between battlefield and sick room anymore. The entire city had become both. When Amida finally fell after a brutal siege, the disaster was remembered for its violence, its military importance, and the suffering of those trapped within. But the outbreak gives the story a darker dimension. The city was not merely conquered from the outside. It had already been weakened by the invisible pressure building within its own enclosure. The walls slowed the Persian army. They did not slow infection. Amida reveals one of the cruelest truths of ancient urban survival. A wall can be a shield against spears, arrows, and cavalry. But when disease begins inside the wall, protection turns into containment. The city did not only endure a siege, it became one. Seleucia. In 165 CE, on the banks of the Tigris River, the ancient city of Seleucia stood at the edge of catastrophe. Once founded as a Hellenistic capital and later absorbed into the violent frontier between Rome and Parthia, Seleucia was not an isolated desert ruin. It was a dense, wealthy, multilingual city tied to trade routes, military roads, river traffic, temples, warehouses, markets, and imperial ambition. Roman forces under the command of Avidius Cassius entered the region during the eastern campaigns of Lucius Verus. The city was taken, its streets were looted, its sanctuaries were disturbed, its population was exposed to the machinery of conquest. Then, according to ancient tradition, something far worse than plunder began to move with the victorious army. The disease that followed would later be remembered as the Antonine Plague, one of the most destructive pandemics of the Roman world. The exact origin remains debated, and no ancient writer could identify the pathogen. Some later historians associated the outbreak with the sack of Seleucia, describing the sickness as if it had been released from the east and carried westward by Roman soldiers. Whether Seleucia was the true source or one point in a larger chain, the idea itself is terrifying. A city captured in victory may have become the doorway through which death entered the empire. The symptoms recorded across the Roman world were severe: fever, diarrhea, throat inflammation, skin eruptions, exhaustion. In some descriptions, pustules appeared across the body, scabbing and leaving marks on those who survived. Modern theories often point towards smallpox, though certainty is impossible. But to the soldiers leaving Seleucia, the illness would not have had a name. It would have been a strange weakness in the ranks. A man who marched yesterday could collapse today. A comrade who shared bread at sunrise could be burning by sunset. The army that had entered the east as a weapon of Rome began returning as a carrier. This is what makes Seleucia different from the other cities in this list. Its horror lies not only in what happened inside its walls, but in what may have left through its gates. Soldiers were the perfect vessels for ancient contagion. They traveled in groups, slept in shared camps, drank from common sources, handled the dead, carried wounds, reused clothing, and moved across hundreds of miles under physical stress. A military route could become a disease route. A supply line could become a vein of infection. The same logistical genius that allowed Rome to project power across continents allowed sickness to travel with imperial precision. The aftermath was devastating. As the disease moved west, it reached army camps, provincial towns, ports, and eventually Rome itself. The empire's strength became its weakness. Roads, ships, forts, barracks, and markets formed a connected body, and the plague moved through that body like poison through blood. The soldiers who survived the Eastern campaign did not simply bring home memories of war. They may have carried the biological echo of Seleucia. Ancient authorities had no way to stop this chain. They could burn incense, consult omens, isolate the obviously sick, and pray to the gods, but they could not understand incubation. A healthy-looking soldier could carry death before any mark appeared on his skin. A robe taken as loot, a blanket from a camp, a slave taken from an infected district, or a wound dressed with contaminated cloth could become part of a transmission path no one could see. Seleucia itself faded from the center of history, but the shadow attached to its name remained. Was the city truly the origin of the Antonine Plague, or did later writers turn it into a symbol because empires need a place to blame when disaster has no face? The answer remains uncertain, but the pattern is clear enough to disturb. Rome marched east seeking victory and returned with a force no general could command. Seleucia may not have fallen because of disease. Its darker legacy is that disease may have marched out after the conquest. Rome. In 166 CE, the heart of the Roman Empire began to receive soldiers returning from the eastern frontier. They came back through roads, ports, camps, and staging towns, carrying trophies, wounds, rumors, and exhaustion from campaigns against Parthia. Rome had seen war before. Rome had absorbed fire, famine, riots, assassinations, and political shock. But this time, the danger did not arrive as a rebel army outside the gates. It arrived inside the bodies of men who looked at first like survivors. The disease spread through the empire during the reign of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. Later generations would call it the Antonine Plague. In Rome, the outbreak found the perfect environment. The city was enormous by ancient standards, packed with apartment blocks, public baths, temples, markets, barracks, workshops, brothels, latrines, fountains, animal pens, and grain warehouses. Every day, thousands of people touched the same doors, drank from shared sources, crowded into the same streets, and gathered for spectacle, trade, worship, and law. Rome was not simply a city. Rome was an organism of movement. Once disease entered that organism, the empire's capital became a chamber of transmission. The physician Galen witnessed the outbreak and left descriptions that have shaped modern debate. The symptoms included fever, diarrhea, throat distress, exhaustion, and eruptions on the skin. In some cases, the rash became dry and scabbed, suggesting to many modern scholars that the disease may have been smallpox. But certainty remains impossible. No preserved pathogen has been recovered. No Roman medical archive gives a complete diagnosis. What survives is the outline of a biological disaster that struck both civilians and soldiers, killing across rank and class with terrifying indifference. Rome's power made the plague worse. The empire was designed to move things efficiently. Grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, oil from Hispania, troops from the Danube, slaves from conquered lands, messages from governors, tax shipments, religious pilgrims, merchants, sailors, animals, and luxury goods all flowed toward the capital. The same arteries that fed Rome also fed the outbreak. A disease did not need to conquer the empire. The empire transported the disease for itself. The human impact must have been staggering. Apartment blocks became fever houses. Public baths, once symbols of Roman order and hygiene, became places of risk. Markets thinned as fear spread. Funeral workers struggled with the volume of death. Families that depended on daily labor faced hunger when workers fell sick. Soldiers stationed near the city could carry the illness back into military networks. Officials attempted to maintain grain distribution, policing, burial, and imperial ceremony, while the city's invisible foundation, its people, weakened day by day. The psychological wound was just as deep. Rome had trained its population to believe in discipline, law, engineering, hierarchy, and divine favor. Aqueducts brought water across impossible distances. Roads cut through mountains. Legions crushed enemy states. Emperors claimed cosmic legitimacy. Yet none of that could identify the thing passing from body to body. The plague exposed a truth the empire could not easily absorb. Rome could organize the world, but Rome could not command the unseen. There was no single moment when Rome fell because of the Antonine Plague. That would be too simple. But the outbreak weakened manpower, strained the army, disrupted trade, reduced tax income, and damaged public confidence during a critical period. It did not destroy Rome in one blow. It opened cracks inside the structure. Later disasters would find those cracks waiting. This is why Rome belongs near the center of this story. The plague did not strike a remote village or a forgotten border town. It struck the capital of the most powerful system in the Mediterranean world. A city that believed every road led to Rome discovered that every road could also bring death back. Rome had built an empire of connection. The plague proved connection could become a weapon. Pelusium. In 541 CE, at the eastern edge of Egypt's Nile Delta, the port city of Pelusium became the first visible wound in one of the deadliest pandemics of the ancient world. Pelusium was not a legendary capital like Rome or Constantinople, but its position made it dangerously important. It stood near the routes where Egypt, the Levant, the Mediterranean, and the desert world touched. Grain moved through this region. Ships moved through this region. Soldiers, merchants, sailors, dock workers, tax officials, priests, animals, and storage crews passed through its gates. Pelusium was a hinge between continents. Then the hinge began to rot. The outbreak, later known as the Plague of Justinian, is often described as entering the Byzantine world through Egypt, before spreading across the Mediterranean. Pelusium sits at the center of that terrifying geography. A port city that handled grain was never just a place of trade. It was a living warehouse. Massive stores of wheat attracted rats. Rats carried fleas. Fleas could carry the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. No one in Pelusium understood that chain. To the people watching the first victims collapse, the disease would have seemed to come from nowhere, as if death had risen out of the grain itself. The symptoms were horrifying and unfamiliar. Victims developed fever, chills, delirium, weakness, and painful swellings in the groin, armpits, or neck. These swellings, later known as buboes, turned the body into visible evidence of invasion. Some victims fell into confusion. Some saw visions. Some died within days. Others lingered in agony while families tried to decide whether to touch them, move them, isolate them, or pray over them. The disease did not announce itself like an army. It emerged in bodies, one household at a time, until the pattern became undeniable. Pelusium's danger was movement. Grain did not stay in Pelusium. Ships loaded it. Caravans carried it. Officials counted it. Laborers lifted sacks from storage to docks. Rats moved through the warehouses, between baskets, beams, ropes, and hulls. Fleas moved between animals and humans. A single infected port could become a launch point for a disaster far beyond its own walls. Once the disease entered the shipping system, the sea became a road for contagion. Alexandria could receive it. Palestine could receive it. Constantinople could receive it. The empire's food supply became a delivery system for death. The authorities at Pelusium would have faced a problem with no acceptable solution. If the port closed, grain stopped moving. If grain stopped moving, larger cities starved. If ships continued to depart, disease might spread. But without germ theory, no official could clearly prove that the sacks, rats, fleas, sailors, or warehouses were the danger. They could see bodies. They could not see transmission. The invisible part of the catastrophe remained hidden inside ordinary logistics. This is what makes Pelusium so chilling. The city may have looked functional even as the pandemic began its wider journey. Dock cranes still moved. Ledgers were still marked. Ships still waited for cargo. Guards still watched the gates. Priests still offered prayers. But beneath the routine, a new force had entered the machinery of empire. Every departing vessel may have been more than a transport. Every grain hold may have been a sealed chamber of infection. Every sailor walking onto a deck may have carried the first step of a continental disaster. When later accounts describe the plague reaching Constantinople, the horror becomes imperial. But before the capital filled with bodies, before mass graves opened, before Justinian's dream of restoration began to tremble, there was a quieter gateway. Pelusium did not need to fall by siege. It only needed to keep working. The city's mystery is not that disease appeared there. The mystery is how long death may have been moving through the port before anyone understood that the empire itself was helping it travel. Antioch. In 542 CE, in the great city of Antioch, one of the richest and most important urban centers of the eastern Mediterranean, began to face a terror that did not come only once. Antioch had already endured earthquakes, fires, invasions, religious conflict, and political instability. Yet the city still stood as a place of churches, markets, colonnaded streets, baths, theaters, workshops, and trade routes linking Syria, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean coast. It was a city built on movement, faith, and recovery. But when the plague reached Antioch during the age of Justinian, recovery itself became uncertain. The disease did not strike a quiet population. Antioch was crowded, active, and deeply connected. Merchants arrived from the east. Pilgrims moved through sacred sites. Soldiers passed between imperial fronts. Farmers brought food from the surrounding countryside. Refugees entered when war or famine pressed against the region. Every group added life to the city. Every group also created another possible path for infection. By the time the plague appeared, Antioch was not merely vulnerable. It was open from too many directions. The symptoms matched the nightmare spreading across the Byzantine world. Fever came first, then weakness, confusion, and swelling in the groin, armpits, or neck. Some victims developed blackened tissue. Some collapsed into delirium. Some appeared only mildly sick before death came suddenly. Others suffered long enough for families to understand exactly what was happening and still be unable to stop it. The body became a warning sign. A swelling under the skin could turn a living person into someone already marked. What made Antioch especially haunting was the city's religious atmosphere. This was not a place without spiritual language. Antioch was one of the major centers of early Christianity, filled with bishops, clergy, monks, relics, sermons, processions, and theological argument. The people had words for sin, judgment, mercy, apocalypse, and divine testing. When plague filled the streets, those words became heavier. Was the city being punished? Was the outbreak a trial? Were prayers failing, or was survival itself the answer? In Antioch, disease did not only attack flesh, it entered doctrine. The churches must have become places of contradiction. The sick came seeking comfort, but crowds increased danger. Priests were expected to offer care, but every visit to a dying household exposed the living. Funerals were necessary, but repeated funerals transformed ritual into exhaustion. Bells, chants, incense, and prayers could not conceal the smell of bodies waiting too long for burial. The city's sacred spaces were forced to carry the weight of a biological disaster no theology could fully explain. Then came the deeper fear. The plague returned. Like many outbreaks of the Justinianic pandemic, it did not behave like a single passing storm. It came in waves across decades, striking regions again after survivors had begun to believe the worst had ended. That pattern is psychologically devastating. A city can rebuild after one catastrophe. But recurring plague teaches the population that safety may be temporary, that every recovery may be an interval, and that every new fever could be the first signal of another descent. Authorities could not solve the rhythm. They could bury bodies, issue orders, restrict movement, manage grain, and call for prayer. But the cause remained invisible. Rats moved through storage rooms. Fleas moved through bedding, clothing, and grain depots. Travelers moved through gates. None of these ordinary details looked like an invasion. That was the true horror. The plague hid inside normal life. A sack of grain, a pilgrim's cloak, a ship's rope, a market stall, a sleeping mat, a corpse carried too late, any of them could become part of the chain. Antioch survived, but survival came with repetition. Each wave stripped away another layer of certainty. The city had been damaged by earthquakes before, yet earthquakes ended. Stones fell, dust settled, rebuilding began. Plague was different. Plague could leave the buildings standing while making the streets feel condemned. It could spare the walls and still hollow out the city behind them. Antioch had endured disasters from the earth, from armies, and from fire. But the recurring plague taught a colder lesson. Some catastrophes do not destroy a city in one moment. They return until the city no longer trusts life to continue. Constantinople. In 542 CE, inside Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the dead began to exceed the city's ability to count them. This was not a poor frontier settlement or a forgotten port at the edge of the map. Constantinople was the guarded heart of imperial power, protected by enormous walls, supplied by sea routes, decorated with churches, palaces, forums, aqueducts, granaries, and administrative offices that controlled a world stretching across the Mediterranean. Emperor Justinian ruled from this city with a vision of restoring Roman greatness. Then the plague entered, and the capital of order became a capital of bodies. The disease likely arrived through the same system that kept the city alive. Grain ships came from Egypt. Cargo moved through harbors. Warehouses stored food for a massive population. Rats moved among sacks, ropes, beams, drains, and ship holds. Fleas moved from rats to humans. No official standing on the docks could see that chain. To the eye, the city was receiving food. In reality, Constantinople may have been receiving a biological siege hidden inside its own supply network. The first cases may have seemed isolated. A dock worker with fever, a sailor unable to rise, a grain handler with swollen glands. But soon the pattern became impossible to ignore. Victims developed sudden fever, delirium, weakness, and painful swellings in the groin, armpits, or neck. Some fell into coma, Some wandered in confusion, some screamed from pain, others died so quickly that the living barely had time to react. The buboes turned the body into a visible map of invasion. Death was no longer abstract. Death had marks. Constantinople's density made the outbreak catastrophic. Families lived in crowded quarters. Markets pulled people together. Churches filled with prayer. Baths, fountains, workshops, barracks, bakeries, and ports kept the city moving, even as infection spread through that movement. The capital's greatest systems became impossible to separate from the disaster. Grain had to be unloaded. Bread had to be baked. Water had to flow. Guards had to stand watch. Clerks had to record orders. Priests had to bury the dead. Every duty became exposure. Ancient accounts describe the death toll in numbers so large they become difficult to imagine. Whether exact figures were exaggerated or not, the social reality was clear. The city could not bury people fast enough. Bodies lay in houses. Bodies lay in streets. Bodies were carried in carts. Tombs filled. Pits were opened. Some corpses were stacked in towers or mass burial spaces because normal funeral systems collapsed. The smell of death became part of the city's air. A capital built to govern nations struggled with the simplest task of all, removing its dead. Even the emperor was not untouched. Justinian reportedly fell ill and survived. That detail matters. The plague entered the palace as well as the alley. It crossed class, rank, office, and sacred status. Imperial clothing, guards, marble floors, and golden mosaics offered no true protection. When the ruler himself became vulnerable, the illusion of command weakened. If the emperor could fall sick, then the empire was not above the disease. The empire was inside it. Government response could only manage consequences. Officials organized burial crews, controlled food distribution, and tried to keep the machinery of state from freezing. But they could not name the cause. They could not stop the ships without starving the city. They could not stop movement without breaking administration. They could not see the small carriers moving through grain, bedding, clothing, and bodies. The plague had entered the capital through necessity itself. Constantinople survived, but the plague damaged Justinian's world. Armies needed men, taxes needed workers, cities needed trade, fields needed labor. The emperor's grand project of restoration met a force that did not negotiate with ambition. The walls of Constantinople remained standing. Hagia Sophia still rose above the city. The bureaucracy continued, but beneath the surface, the capital had been shown something unforgivable. Even the center of empire could become helpless. Constantinople had walls that could stop armies for centuries. But the plague did not climb them. It sailed in through the harbor, rode inside the grain, and waited in the dark until the city fed it. Ctesiphon. In 628 CE, on the eastern bank of the Tigris River, the Sasanian capital of Ctesiphon entered one of the darkest moments in its long imperial history. This was not a minor city at the edge of civilization. Ctesiphon was the seat of Persian kings, a vast urban center of palaces, military offices, royal treasuries, religious authority, court officials, merchants, soldiers, servants, and foreign envoys. Its great vaulted halls were built to project permanence. Its rulers had challenged Rome and Byzantium for centuries. But after years of exhausting war, political fracture, and famine pressure, a disease began moving through the capital at the worst possible time. It would later be remembered as the Plague of Shiro. The outbreak came during the brief reign of Kavad II, also known as Sharo, who had seized the throne after the overthrow and execution of his father, Khosrow II. The empire he inherited was already wounded. Decades of war against Byzantium had drained armies, emptied treasuries, disrupted agriculture, and weakened political loyalty. Ctesiphon still looked like a capital, but beneath the palace ceremony, the empire's structure was fragile. Then the plague struck the royal city, and fragility became collapse. The disease reportedly killed with terrifying speed. Ancient sources suggest that the outbreak spread through Mesopotamia and struck the highest levels of Sasanian society. Nobles died, officials died, soldiers died, members of the royal household died. Kavad II himself is said to have died during the plague after only months on the throne. Whether every detail can be confirmed is impossible, but the effect was clear. The disease did not remain in the alleys. It reached the throne. That is what makes Ctesiphon different from many other ancient plague cities. In Athens, disease broke civic order. In Constantinople, disease overwhelmed burial systems. In Ctesiphon, disease appears to have struck directly at succession. A monarchy depends on continuity. When rulers die too quickly, heirs are contested, generals maneuver, court factions turn against one another, and the machinery of power begins to tear itself apart. The plague did not need to destroy the palace walls. It only needed to remove the people who made the palace function. Inside Ctesiphon, the atmosphere must have been suffocating. Messengers arriving from infected districts, priests performing rites for nobles whose names could not be spoken too loudly, palace servants afraid to enter sick chambers, physicians moving between elite households without understanding how the disease followed them, soldiers guarding gates while rumors spread that the king himself had been marked. The city was not merely sick, it was waiting to learn whether the empire still had a center. The symptoms are not preserved with the detail needed for a modern diagnosis. The word plague may refer to bubonic plague or another epidemic disease moving through the exhausted population of the Near East. But the uncertainty deepens the mystery. What exactly killed so many at the height of the Sasanian crisis? Was it carried by trade routes, military movement, rodents, contaminated supplies, or displaced populations after war? No final answer survives. The outbreak remains partly visible through consequence rather than laboratory evidence. After the plague, the Sasanian Empire entered a rapid succession crisis. Multiple rulers rose and fell in a short span. Authority fragmented. Regional commanders gained power. The imperial structure that had once resisted Rome for centuries became dangerously unstable. Within a few years, the Arab-Muslim conquests would begin pushing into Sasanian territory. By then, the empire was not facing the future from a position of strength. It was facing invasion after plague, war, and internal fracture had already hollowed it out. Ctesiphon was not destroyed by disease alone. History is rarely that simple, but the plague of Shiro struck like a hidden blade at the exact place where empire was most vulnerable: continuity. The capital survived in stone for a time, but the living system inside it was damaged beyond easy repair. Ctesiphon had guarded the throne of kings. But when the plague entered the palace, the empire discovered that even royalty could become just another body in the count. Conclusion: these ancient outbreaks reveal a disturbing pattern. The cities were not weak, primitive, or unprepared in the ways people often imagine. Athens had walls. Hattusa had royal archives and temple rituals. Rome had roads, armies, aqueducts, and imperial administration. Constantinople had harbors, granaries, palaces, and one of the most powerful governments on earth. Ctesiphon had kings, treasuries, and centuries of political authority. Yet all of them faced the same enemy. Not an army at the gate, but a force too small to see and too fast to understand. The deeper terror is that disease used civilization against itself. Crowded streets became transmission corridors. Harbors became entry points. Grain ships became carriers, siege walls became traps, temples became fever shelters. Palaces became sick rooms, the very systems built to protect, feed, connect, and govern these cities became the channels through which death moved. Ancient rulers tried to respond with prayer, burial orders, public control, military discipline, and desperate explanations. But without knowing the invisible mechanisms behind contagion, they were fighting shadows. Every city searched for meaning. Some blamed gods, some blamed enemies, some blamed moral decay. But the bodies kept arriving. What disappeared in these outbreaks was not only population, it was confidence. The belief that walls could protect, that kings could command, that rituals could restore order, that empires could master the world around them. The question is not why ancient cities feared plague. The question is how many civilizations were changed by diseases they never had the tools to name.